In the year 1789, when much of the wider Atlantic world seemed to tremble with events that later generations would describe as revolutionary, the broad expanse of the Americas entered a long period whose character can only be understood not by the suddenness of battles or the clamor of political debates, but rather by the slow unfolding of daily life, the small, repeated gestures of households, the patient continuation of agricultural rhythms, the careful and often tedious management of new governments, and the long endurance of older colonial structures that still reached across much of the southern continent. And it is in this slow, deliberate atmosphere that one must imagine the Americas at the dawn of the final decade of the 18th century. For while the United States had declared its independence and written its constitution, the practical experience of governing was not carried out in the language of fireworks or daring, but in the steady scratching of quills upon parchment, the measured tones of debate spoken in candle-lit rooms where men wore powdered wigs and heavy coats, and the daily lives of citizens were marked more by the turning of seasons than by the turning of political fortunes, so that each village, each town, each homestead found its place in an order that was largely repetitive, comforting in its predictability, and conducive to the kind of monotony that stretches through the years like a slow river winding through wide valleys. And if one pauses to imagine those rivers, the Mississippi, the Ohio, the St. Lawrence, the Amazon, the Orinoco, one must picture them not in flood or tempest, but in calm and steady flow, bearing barges of timber, sacks of grain, or casks of spirits, the water lapping gently against the hulls, while the oarsmen moved with unchanging rhythm, and on their banks fields extended in geometric regularity, furrow after furrow cut by ploughs drawn by oxen whose steps were as patient as time itself, while in nearby farmhouses the same routines were repeated from morning to evening, bread baked, porridge stirred, livestock tended, tools sharpened, clothes mended, children instructed, prayers recited, and sleep taken, only to rise and repeat the cycle again, day after day, year after year, until the very substance of history seemed less a series of events than a long and drowsy persistence. And if one considers the architecture of these years, whether in the wooden clapboard houses of New England villages, the red brick dwellings of Philadelphia, the sprawling plantations of Virginia, the haciendas of Mexico, or the stone and stucco edifices of Lima and Quito, one finds again a sameness that resists the intrusion of novelty. 4 rooms were arranged in familiar proportions, furniture was heavy and durable, hearths were the central feature, candles flickered slowly, and the colors were muted browns, grays, and off-whites, all of which contributed to a mood that was less dramatic than continuous. And in these interiors people passed long hours engaged in tasks that were rarely urgent, spinning thread, reading aloud from religious texts, copying letters, or slowly embroidering patterns onto fabrics, each stitch a tiny echo of the measured order of time itself. And outside the houses, the towns and cities moved at a pace that would strike the modern observer as extraordinarily slow, with carts creaking over uneven streets, shopkeepers arranging their wares in small wooden stalls, apprentices hammering steadily at anvils, cobblers repairing shoes, printers setting type letter by letter, the smell of ink and paper mingling with the smell of smoke from countless chimneys, and above it all the bells of churches tolled, not with excitement but with calm regularity, marking the passage of hours that differed little from one day to the next, so that life itself seemed an exercise in repetition, and this repetition was no less evident in the southern half of the hemisphere, where Spanish and Portuguese officials maintained colonial routines that had changed little in centuries. For the viceroys held audiences in grand halls decorated with tapestries. Scribes kept long registers of land, labor, and tribute. Priests led processions that followed the same calendar of saints' days year after year, and in the plazas, merchants spread their goods beneath the sun, textiles, foodstuffs, and small metal tools displayed on cloths or in baskets, while mules stood tethered patiently nearby, their ears flicking at flies, and people moved slowly between stalls, examining, bargaining, pausing, and moving on, all at a pace that gave to commerce the air of ritual rather than adventure. And if one turns to the great plantations and mines, one sees again the monotony of repetition, for sugar was cut, cane by cane, in rows that seemed endless. Cotton was plucked bowl by bowl, silver was brought up from shafts in loads that differed little from day to day, and all of it moved along the same trade routes, packed into barrels and crates, loaded onto ships whose sails filled with familiar winds, and carried across the seas with journeys measured not in excitement but in long weeks of similar days, the horizon unchanging, the waves constant, the meals aboard simple and repeated, salted meat, hard bread, and small measures of rum, until land was sighted, docks were approached, and the whole cycle of unloading, accounting, and distributing resumed with the sameness of an unbroken circle. And so the history of the Americas in this initial moment after 1789 must be described not as a drama of sudden transformation, but as a long unfolding of continuity, in which governments slowly found their footing, households steadily continued their labors, fields repeated their harvests, markets restocked and reopened, ships came and went, bells rang, quills scratched, and the people of two continents lived lives whose greatest characteristic was their calm endurance, a quality that, though lacking in spectacle, holds within it the true shape of historical time, which is patient, monotonous, and soothingly predictable, and to read of such years is to feel a kind of drowsiness descend, as if one were listening to the soft ticking of a clock in a quiet room, where nothing need be rushed, and everything unfolds in its place, measured and inevitable, as the great continent, north and south alike, entered the long 19th century with the steady breath of continuity filling its lungs. If the closing years of the 18th century in the Americas were marked by the slow stabilization of governments, the persistence of colonial structures, and the endlessly repetitive routines of agriculture, commerce, and devotion, then the early decades of the 19th century can best be described as a period in which the notion of independence, though increasingly spoken of in proclamations and letters, unfolded not in sudden bursts, but in long processes of negotiation, adjustment, and adaptation. And nowhere is this more evident than in the slow emergence of republican institutions in the North and the gradual loosening of imperial authority in the South. For while the United States, under Washington, Adams, Jefferson, and Madison, carried forward the project of self-rule, their administrations were less dramatic in the day-to-day than posterity sometimes imagines, consisting largely of the same measured debates, the same ceremonial receptions, the same painstaking drafting of statutes, and the same patient maintenance of armies and treasuries, so that the grand ideals of democracy translated in daily life into hours upon hours of committee deliberations, cautious correspondence, and careful balancing of ledgers, and in the broader countryside the lives of farmers and artisans changed hardly at all, as they rose with the sun, tended their stock, mended their tools, and measured their days by the repetition of seasons, the monotony of ploughing, planting, harvesting, and storing, while their wives and daughters repeated the endless tasks of baking, spinning, weaving, sewing, and teaching, the hearth and the loom binding households in the same patterns that had governed them in the preceding century. And if one examines the towns of these early years of the 19th century, one finds them spreading outward with slow regularity, streets laid in grids, houses built with similar proportions, schools established with rote curricula, churches planted as central squares, taverns and inns keeping steady trade, and newspapers, increasingly printed, carried on presses that clanked rhythmically, their pages filled with speeches, notices, advertisements, and the occasional report from Europe, yet all of it carried out with the same dull persistence, the repetition of type set letter by letter, ink rolled with rollers, sheets pressed with the same weight, until bundles were tied and distributed, so that news itself seemed part of the slow, almost mechanical fabric of time. And when one turns attention to the Southern Americas in these same years, the slow unwinding of colonial rule appears similarly stretched across decades, for though names such as Bolivar and San Martin are remembered for the drama of battles, the lived reality for the majority was one of prolonged marches, endless meetings, proclamations written and rewritten, supplies gathered slowly, letters dispatched by horse over great distances, and victories, when they came, followed by long periods of organization, compromise, and further waiting, so that the wars of independence, though marked by decisive dates in history books, were experienced on the ground as long periods of uncertainty, hunger, and slow endurance, with towns waiting months for news, villages sending contributions of food or clothing, and families continuing their monotonous lives under changing flags but unchanging necessities, for crops still needed tending, children still needed raising, and prayers still needed repeating, regardless of whether the authority above was a king, a viceroy, or a new republic. And so the story of the early 19th century in the Americas, both North and South, must be told not in trumpet blasts, but in the measured toll of bells, the clack of type, the shuffle of boots on long dusty roads, the patient breathing of oxen in fields, and the soft murmurs of families gathered around tables at night, their candles burning low, their conversations turning again and again to the same matters of weather, health, prices, and local happenings, all of which created a continuity that dulled the sharper edges of political transformation. And if one imagines the interiors of homes in these years, one must see shelves slowly filling with books, particularly in the North, where libraries grew by increments, each volume bound in leather, stacked with care, borrowed, read slowly, and returned, while in the South, the forms of Spanish and Portuguese domestic life lingered with tiled floors, heavy wooden furniture, religious paintings on walls, and the daily rhythm of servants and family members moving through rooms in familiar patterns. And outside these houses, the plazas of cities remained central, their fountains flowing at the same pace, their benches occupied by idlers and merchants, their markets opening and closing in tune with the rising and setting of the sun, so that one could almost fall asleep simply walking their squares, lulled by the sameness of it all. And yet beneath this sameness lay the gradual accretion of new identities, the slow acceptance of republican forms, the cautious drafting of constitutions, the measured establishment of schools and armies, all carried out in a manner so deliberate that the very slowness of it becomes the story itself. For the Americas in the early 19th century moved not like a galloping horse, but like a cart drawn by oxen, steady, heavy, predictable, carrying the weight of entire societies forward with the calm inevitability of repetition. And thus, this chapter, devoted to the emergence of independent republics and the persistence of old ways, must be understood less as a narrative of sudden excitement than as a gentle recounting of years upon years in which lives were lived. Crops were grown, laws were written, and bells continued to toll, slowly, steadily, and without end. As the 19th century settled further into its long and almost uneventful course, stretching through the 1820s and 1830s with the kind of slow inevitability that marks the progress of rivers as they wear their banks by gentle erosion rather than sudden flood, the Americas found themselves immersed in a pattern of expansion, settlement, and cautious development that was marked far more by gradual routines than by the dramatic shifts that textbooks often compress into a few pages. For in the United States, the notion of westward movement, so often remembered as a surge of adventurous pioneers, was in reality a long, weary sequence of wagon wheels turning upon rutted paths, oxen plodding step by step, families packing and unpacking the same bundles, building cabins out of logs cut with the same repetitive blows of axes, and clearing fields by the same tedious burning of brush, so that the expansion into territories such as Ohio, Indiana, and beyond had less the air of drama than of monotonous persistence, each new homestead resembling the last, each settlement repeating the familiar forms of church, schoolhouse, tavern, and store. And behind this westward repetition lay the equally monotonous deliberations of Congress, which debated land ordinances, tariffs, and boundaries with the same long-winded speeches that droned on for hours, punctuated only by the scratching of pens recording votes. And if one considers the broader cultural life of these decades, one finds again a steady, unhurried accumulation of habits and practices. For newspapers, multiplied in number but not in novelty, their columns filled with the same mixture of local notices, sermons, moral essays, and slow reports of foreign affairs, while the Post continued to deliver letters that, despite covering greater distances, still carried the same repetitive concerns of health, harvest, prices, and family news. And across the southern continent, where independence movements had established new republics, the pattern was similar. 4 constitutions were drafted and redrafted, elections held with cautious regularity, and officials presided over parliaments that echoed with the same voices day after day, their proceedings often stretching into hours of debate that left most citizens unmoved, since the details of law, taxation, and custom did little to alter the repetitive rhythms of life in villages and towns, where markets opened in the morning, where vendors sold produce, cloth, and tools, where livestock lowed in corrals, and where the ringing of bells from churches marked the hours just as they had under colonial rule, creating a sense that though the flags had changed, the substance of daily existence had not. And in Brazil, where Portuguese authority gave way to imperial forms under Pedro I and later Pedro II, the slow pageantry of monarchy unfolded in ceremonies that, though described in the press, were experienced by most as distant events, while their actual lives were filled with the ongoing and repetitive labor of plantations, workshops, and households, where slaves, servants, and free citizens alike repeated gestures of cooking, cleaning, planting, harvesting, and mending, all of which contributed to the vast tapestry of monotony that defined these decades. And even the great question of slavery, though filled with moral urgency, was lived day by day as a series of endlessly repeated routines. The rising at dawn, the trudging to fields, the cutting of cane, the picking of cotton, the carrying of loads, the singing of songs to make the work bearable, the return to quarters, the eating of simple meals, the slow moments of rest before sleep, and the rising again the next day. So that bondage itself became a system of endless monotony, heavy with suffering, but equally heavy with repetition. And thus the era is remembered less for sudden transformation than for its long, dragging continuity. And if one looks to the cultural and intellectual pursuits of the age, one sees libraries filling slowly, sermons delivered weekly in tones that rarely varied, novels serialized in newspapers over months, read slowly aloud by families gathered in parlors where the light of candles or oil lamps flickered faintly, their eyes growing heavy as voices droned on, and schools where lessons were repeated by rote, multiplication tables chanted, Latin declensions recited, geography traced slowly upon slates, and all of it giving to education a rhythm of monotony that matched the wider society. And as the 1830s gave way to the 1840s, the transportation networks of canals, roads, and the earliest railways began to extend. But again, the lived experience was not one of sudden excitement, but of long journeys. Boats pulled by mules along towpaths, stagecoaches rattling slowly along roads, trains moving at what now seems a crawl, passengers staring out at fields, woods, and towns that resembled one another so much that the journey itself seemed an exercise in repetition. And when they arrived at their destinations, they found towns laid out in the same grids, with similar taverns, stores, churches, and houses, the sameness of which could lull even the most observant into a kind of waking sleep. And thus the Americas of this period, though expanding in population, territory, and commerce, did so in a manner that was profoundly repetitive, steady, and monotonous, so that history here takes on the quality of a slow ticking clock in a quiet room, marking hours that pass with little distinction, carrying societies forward in the same slow rhythm, a rhythm that induced calm, continuity, and a certain drowsy inevitability. By the time the Americas drifted into the 1840s and 1850s, the slow pulse of life across the continent continued its unhurried rhythm, a rhythm that can only be understood by contemplating the sheer persistence of ordinary details. For though this era is remembered for conflicts brewing in the North over slavery, for revolutions echoing across parts of Latin America, and for the slow modernization of trade and travel, the reality experienced by most inhabitants was one of quiet repetition, where each day bore such resemblance to the last that time itself seemed to flatten into an endless plain of sameness. And one must imagine the farmers of the Midwestern United States rising at dawn as they had done for decades, leading horses or oxen to plough the same furrows, planting corn, wheat, or rye in fields that had been cleared log by log in earlier years, while their wives and daughters prepared bread, churned butter, spun wool, and wove cloth, their gestures unchanged from one generation to the next. And in New England, where textile mills began to hum with the mechanical whir of looms, the lives of young women employed there were marked not by adventure but by endless repetition, as they rose from dormitories at the same hour, walked to factories, tended the same machines, ate their meals at prescribed times, and retired again at evening, the days blending into one another like the cloth that rolled steadily from the machines, smooth, uniform, and unbroken. And in the cities, which grew more populous in these years, the routines of commerce expanded, but did not alter their essential rhythm. For shopkeepers opened shutters each morning, arranged goods upon counters, weighed flour and sugar upon scales, accepted coins or notes, and swept floors in the evening, while carriages rattled slowly down cobbled streets, delivering passengers or packages with the same monotonous regularity, and above them all, church bells tolled the hours, marking time in tones that had not changed for centuries, their sound carrying across rooftops and down alleys, a steady metronome against which the lives of all citizens were measured. And when one looks to the countryside of Latin America in these decades, the persistence of haciendas and plantations is equally marked by monotony, for workers moved along, rows of sugar cane or coffee plants, repeating the same motions hour after hour, while overseers walked slowly with watchful eyes, and in the cities, officials in young republics copied decrees, debated tariffs, and planned ceremonies in buildings that still bore colonial architecture, their tiled floors, thick walls, and shaded courtyards providing the backdrop for conversations that droned on in the heat, with clerks recording notes line after line in great leather-bound books, each entry nearly identical to the last, so that the very act of governance seemed an exercise in patient monotony. And if one considers the intellectual and cultural pursuits of the age, one finds them equally repetitive in their structure. 4 sermons were preached every Sunday, with variations on familiar themes. Novels were read aloud in parlours over weeks and months, with listeners hearing the same cadences of moral instruction, while students in schools copied the same lessons in spelling, arithmetic, and geography, their slates filled and erased, in cycles as regular as the seasons, and in homes. The presence of new inventions, such as the telegraph or the sewing machine, arrived slowly, and when they did, they were integrated into routines that were themselves repetitive. The telegraph clicking in rhythmic bursts that repeated codes over and over. The sewing machine's needle rising and falling endlessly, producing stitches that were uniform and steady. And all of this reinforced the sense that history in these years was not a drama of constant novelty, but a slow layering of familiar patterns, stretching across households, towns, and nations alike, so that whether one walked the streets of Boston, New Orleans, Mexico City, Buenos Aires, or Rio de Janeiro, one would have found the same rhythms of carts moving, vendors shouting, priests intoning prayers, teachers reciting lessons, and artisans hammering, stitching, or carving their gestures, echoing those of generations before them. And even as railroads began to extend their tracks across landscapes, promising swifter journeys, the experience of travel remained slow and repetitive. 4 passengers climbed aboard, sat in wooden benches, listened to the churning of wheels, and gazed at passing scenery of fields, woods, and villages that blurred into one another, offering little novelty. And upon arrival, they disembarked into towns laid out in the same grids, with central squares, churches, taverns, and markets, all of which reinforced the sameness of life. And when one contemplates the political tensions of the United States in the 1850s, with the growing divide over slavery, one must remember that these tensions were lived in the monotony of speeches delivered in Congress that stretched for hours, of newspapers reprinting arguments in long columns, of pamphlets distributed in town squares, and of households discussing the matter over and over, their conversations circling the same arguments without resolution. And in the South, the lives of enslaved men and women continued in the endless repetition of field labor, cooking, cleaning, and singing each day a mirror of the last, so that bondage itself was an institution of monotony, reinforced by laws and customs that repeated the same injustices generation after generation, while in the North, free black communities faced the repetitive challenges of discrimination, restricted opportunity, and the constant need to petition for rights that were denied, and thus, whether free or enslaved, citizen or subject, rich or poor, the essential rhythm of life in these decades was one of repetition, persistence, and sameness. A rhythm that lulled societies forward into what would eventually become greater crises, but which at the time felt like an endless continuation of what had already been. And so the 1840s and 1850s in the Americas can best be described as an era of continuity, where the texture of life was woven from the threads of routine, and where history itself seemed to speak not in sudden bursts, but in the soft, steady murmur of repetition, like the turning of a wheel, like the tolling of a bell, like the ticking of a clock in a quiet room, soothing, monotonous, and unchanging. As the 19th century progressed into the years of the 1860s, the Americas entered a stage of life that was, despite the dramatic shadows cast by events such as the Civil War in the United States, the gradual consolidation of republics in Latin America, and the persistence of empire in Brazil, still lived by most people in a rhythm that was so slow, so repetitive, and so unchanging that the apparent grandeur of political events seemed, at the level of daily existence, more like faint disturbances upon the surface of an otherwise placid pond. And to understand this, one must once again enter into the homes, the fields, the workshops, and the towns, where life unfolded with an astonishing sameness. For in the United States, even as soldiers marched and battles raged far away, the households of farmers, artisans, and townspeople continued to revolve around the daily duties that had defined their existence for generations, with men rising before dawn to tend to livestock, to harness horses or oxen, to mend fences and sharpen tools, with women baking bread, milking cows, sewing garments, sweeping floors, and teaching children, and with children themselves reciting lessons in one-room schoolhouses, scratching words and numbers upon slates that were erased and reused endlessly, so that even amidst an age of supposed crisis, the texture of life was marked by continuity rather than disruption. And if one imagines the towns and cities of the 1860s, one finds the same cartwheels turning upon cobbled streets, the same shops opening their shutters each morning, the same apprentices hammering metal or stitching leather, the same clerks copying ledgers, the same ministers preaching sermons, and the same bells ringing from church towers, marking hours that passed with unbroken regularity, while in the countryside the vast fields of wheat, corn, and cotton swayed in the wind just as they had before, their planting and harvesting governed by the same cycles of season and weather, the same back-breaking labor of plowing, sowing, weeding, and reaping repeated year after year. And in the South, where slavery still persisted until the lives of enslaved men, women, and children were structured by the same unyielding monotony of fieldwork, cooking, cleaning, and enforced obedience, their songs echoing rhythms that softened the endless repetition of labor, while, in the North, factories increasingly shaped the lives of working families, the clatter of machines filling the air with ceaseless noise. But the labor itself, though mechanical, was equally repetitive, with hands guiding cloth, tending spindles, stamping metal, or packing goods in boxes, all of which created a sense of sameness that defined industrial as much as agricultural existence. And if one shifts the gaze to Latin America in these same years, one finds that while constitutions were drafted, presidents elected, and armies mobilized in periodic upheavals, the majority of people experienced life as an endless cycle of cultivation, of market trade, of household chores, of prayers and processions, and of routines that altered little with the change of regimes, so that in villages across Mexico, Colombia, Chile, or Argentina, mornings began with the same crowing of roosters, with women lighting fires for cooking, with men leading animals to fields, with children fetching water from wells or rivers, and days proceeded with such familiarity that the shifting flags or new officials in distant capitals barely disturbed the calm flow of existence. And even in Brazil, where the monarchy of Pedro II represented an exception in form, the substance of daily life was woven from the same threads of routine, with court ceremonies repeating themselves in the imperial palace, with officials drafting decrees in the same formal language, with plantations worked by enslaved laborers repeating the same seasonal tasks, and with households maintaining the same order of meals, prayers, and evenings spent in quiet talk or reading, so that the empire itself, though outwardly majestic, was, in truth, another layer of continuity, stretching across years, in which the deeper rhythms of life remained constant. And if one considers transportation in this decade, whether wagons on rutted roads, boats along rivers, or trains that had now extended further into landscapes, one discovers again the slowness of travel. For journeys took days or weeks, passengers endured the same jolts, the same meals of bread and salted meat, the same cramped accommodations, and upon arrival they encountered towns that resembled one another so closely in their arrangement of central square, church, market, and tavern, that the sense of repetition must have been overwhelming, and even communication, sped by telegraph, was experienced as a series of repeated clicks and codes, uniform, monotonous, and stripped of drama, so that news itself arrived in fragments that merged into the already unchanging background of life. And when one turns to the cultural expressions of the age, whether the sermons delivered in churches, the novels serialized in newspapers, the music played in parlors, or the lessons taught in schools, one finds again a sameness of rhythm, words spoken slowly, chapters read aloud in weekly intervals, tunes played again and again upon pianos or fiddles, and lessons drilled by rote until they became second nature, all of which created an atmosphere that was heavy with repetition, so that the very sense of time passing was less about change than about endurance. And thus to describe the 1860s in the Americas is not to recount battles and leaders, but to record the endless sameness of life as it was lived by millions, where meals were taken at regular hours, where streets filled with the same vendors, where factories buzzed with the same machines, where fields yielded the same crops, where bells tolled at the same times, and where the slow, heavy weight of continuity pressed itself upon each day, soothing in its monotony, wearying in its repetition, and unchanging in its effect, carrying societies slowly, almost imperceptibly, toward the later decades of the century. As the Americas entered the 1870s and the 1880s, the rhythm of life, though dressed in the garments of what historians later came to call modernization, remained for the great mass of people an affair of slow repetition, an accumulation of small routines, and a continuity that stretched across decades with such steadiness that the word change, though frequently invoked in political speeches and newspaper editorials, was experienced in daily life as little more than an alteration of surface, while the deep structure of existence moved with the same quiet persistence as before. And one must imagine the farms of the United States Midwest, now broader in scale with the aid of steel plows and reaping machines, yet still governed by the seasonal cycles that had determined agricultural labor for centuries. For the planting of corn, wheat, and oats still took place in spring, the cultivation in summer, and the harvest in autumn, and though the tools had grown heavier and sharper, the motions of the men guiding them, the straining of horses pulling them, and the bending of women and children gathering and storing the produce were all marked by the same gestures of repetition, while in the evenings, families still gathered around wooden tables, lamps burning oil instead of candles perhaps, but the meal of bread, meat, and vegetables was eaten in the same order, with the same prayers murmured in the same tones, followed by hours of quiet conversation, sewing, or reading aloud from newspapers or serialized novels, the words heard, more for their steady rhythm than for their novelty, and in towns that grew in these decades into bustling cities, one must not imagine excitement, but rather the monotony of urban life, where streets filled each morning with carts, carriages, and later horse-drawn trams, where factories blew whistles at the same hours, drawing thousands of workers through iron gates, where machines clattered with ceaseless repetition, and where clerks bent over desks copying figures in ledgers until the pages filled with identical lines, so that industrial progress was experienced less as transformation than as a heightening of sameness. The drone of machines replacing the silence of fields, but carrying the same weight of monotony. And if one shifts to the southern continent in these same years, one finds republics consolidating, armies parading, legislatures meeting, and presidents making speeches, but the lives of the majority still tied to the routines of agriculture. For coffee in Brazil, wheat in Argentina, sugar in the Caribbean, and countless other crops followed the old cycles of planting and harvesting, their cultivation carried out by workers who rose with the same dawns, bent to the same tasks, and ended their days with the same weary gestures, and in towns from Santiago to Montevideo, from Lima to Caracas, the days were measured by the ringing of bells, by the sound of merchants opening shutters, by the cries of vendors selling fruit, cloth, or bread, by children reciting lessons in schools, and by priests delivering sermons whose cadences changed little from one generation to the next, and even in the imperial court of Brazil under Pedro II, where intellectual salons and learned societies debated science, literature, and progress, the routines of official life remained marked by repetition. Sessions opened with ceremonial greetings, papers were read aloud in slow tones, notes were recorded in ledgers, and discussions meandered through familiar topics before closing in orderly fashion, leaving behind the impression not of breakthrough but of endless continuity. And in the north as well, where industrial fairs displayed new inventions, where railroads stretched iron lines across prairies and mountains, and where telegraph wires multiplied across landscapes, the experience for individuals remained one of monotony, for a fair was attended by walking slowly among stalls, pausing at exhibits, reading descriptions, and returning home. A train journey involved purchasing a ticket, sitting for hours upon wooden benches, watching fields, woods, and towns pass by in blurred sameness, and the telegraph continued to click its codes with repetitive rhythm, turning news into short, formulaic lines that blended into the ongoing murmur of life. And if one examines cultural production in these decades, one finds again a saturation of routine, for newspapers filled pages with serialized stories, with advertisements repeating the same phrases, with editorials circling the same arguments. Schools instructed pupils with the same recitations, the same chalk upon slate, the same punishments for errors. Churches intoned the same hymns week after week, season after season, and homes were filled with the same gestures of sweeping, washing, cooking, and sewing, gestures that never ceased, that passed from mother to daughter, from father to son, binding generations in the sameness of work. And if one considers the lives of immigrants arriving in waves to the Americas in these years, seeking new opportunity, one discovers that even their novelty was absorbed into repetition. 4 ships brought them across oceans in voyages marked by the same cramped quarters, the same meals of bread and broth, the same restless days staring at the sea, and upon arrival, their settlement in cities led them into factories, shops, and boarding houses where days followed predictable cycles of labor and rest. And though languages and customs varied, the rhythm of life merged into the monotony of the continent itself, a rhythm of slow work, of repeated prayer, of modest meals, of tired sleep, and of rising again to the same duties. And thus the Americas of the 1870s and 1880s, often remembered as times of transformation, were lived as times of continuity, of sameness heightened rather than broken, of monotony intensified rather than relieved, so that the deeper truth of history in these years is not the drama of events, but the soft, steady hum of repetition, the slow turning of wheels, the clicking of telegraph keys, the tolling of bells, the footsteps of workers, the whispers of prayers, all blending into a lullaby of continuity that carried entire societies through the final decades of the century. As the long 19th century approached its closing decades and the calendar moved into the 1890s, the Americas, stretching from the Canadian provinces in the north to the windswept pampas of Argentina and the rainforests of Brazil in the south, continued to live in the slow rhythm of daily repetition. For though inventions multiplied, though railroads extended further, though telegraphs and even telephones began to hum with the suggestion of immediacy, the lived texture of life remained deeply bound to cycles that unfolded with the same calm monotony that had always governed human affairs on these continents. And one must begin again with the farms, for whether in the wheat fields of the Dakotas, the cornfields of Iowa, the ranches of Texas, or the coffee plantations of Brazil, the year was measured by planting, tending, and harvest, each season requiring gestures that had been performed countless times before, men guiding plows, women preparing food, children assisting with chores, all under skies that shifted from dawn to dusk with patient inevitability, while in towns and cities the routines of commerce unfolded with the same predictability, shops opening their shutters each morning, clerks arranging goods, customers arriving, coins exchanging hands, ledgers being filled, and shutters closing. Again, in the evening, all under the steady ringing of bells or the slow turning of clocks, and those cities now glowed more brightly with gas lamps and in some places with electric bulbs. The light itself illuminated the same patterns of routine. Workers filing from factories, newsboys calling headlines, carriages rattling over cobblestones, families gathering for supper, and churches hosting services in which hymns were sung to the same melodies, prayers intoned in the same cadences, and sermons preached with the same moral exhortations that echoed across centuries, so that novelty was absorbed into the unchanging pattern of repetition. And if one observes cultural life in these years, one sees again a steady accretion rather than sudden transformation. 4 newspapers multiplied but filled their columns with the same types of content advertisements repeating familiar claims. Serialized novels unfolding chapter by chapter with slow inevitability. Political commentary circling familiar debates, while schools taught lessons with the same rote recitations. Chalk dust rising in classrooms where children recited multiplication. Tables and grammar rules, and universities, though growing, conducted lectures in halls where professors spoke slowly for hours, their words filling notebooks line after line, identical in their monotony. And in homes, the presence of new devices like sewing machines or phonographs altered gestures only slightly, for the sewing machine's needle rose and fell with endless repetition, while the phonograph, though marvelous at first hearing, quickly became another source of routine, spinning cylinders again and again to reproduce the same tunes until the novelty dulled into monotony. And in Latin America, the story was much the same, with republics consolidating, presidents making speeches, parliaments meeting in sessions, filled with endless speeches, and officials drafting laws in longhand upon paper that filled volumes of archives, while the lives of ordinary citizens remained tied to agriculture, to small trade, to household duties, and to the repetition of rituals in plazas, churches, and schools. And though railroads extended across the pampas of Argentina or into the highlands of Mexico, the experience of travel remained one of sameness, with passengers enduring the same waiting at stations, the same slow journeys, the same views of fields and hills, and upon arrival, the same arrangement of towns with central squares, churches, and markets, so that the sense of repetition overwhelmed any sense of novelty. And in Brazil, where Pedro II presided until 1889, before the monarchy gave way to a republic, the forms of ceremony shifted, but the substance of routine remained. 4 soldiers paraded in squares as they had under monarchy. Officials debated laws as they had in earlier decades, and plantations continued to yield crops through the same repetitive cycles. And in the Caribbean, where emancipation had altered social structures, the daily lives of freed men and women nonetheless revolved around the same labors of farming, fishing, and household chores, the same prayers in churches, the same markets filled with fruit, spices, and textiles, and the same endless sweep of days that resembled each other so closely that memory blurred them into one. And if one considers intellectual life, the slow spread of newspapers and periodicals again reinforced monotony, for though titles multiplied, the tone and rhythm of articles remained familiar, essays unfolding in long sentences, moral observations repeated endlessly, and debates over trade, tariffs, or education circling the same arguments. And in the arts, novels were written with patient prose, often serialized, read aloud in parlors over weeks. Paintings were exhibited in salons with themes repeated from Europe, and music was played in drawing rooms with tunes that echoed familiar melodies, so that even the arts became another layer of repetition, soothing rather than startling, lulling rather than awakening. And across the hemisphere, weather. In the frozen reaches of Canada, the bustling streets of New York, the plazas of Mexico, the ranches of Argentina, or the plantations of Brazil, the unifying thread was the endless sameness of tasks repeated, of duties fulfilled, of prayers recited, of clocks ticking, and of bells tolling, until the closing decade of the century seemed less a threshold of change than a long corridor of continuity, stretching toward the 20th century with the calm inevitability of footsteps echoing down a hall, steady, predictable, and unchanging. And thus the 1890s in the Americas, so often remembered as the prelude to modernity, were lived as years of repetition, of sameness, and of monotony. A slow unfolding that carried societies forward without haste, without drama, and with the soothing continuity of life lived in rhythms that dulled the senses and encouraged, above all, sleep. As the Americas passed into the first decade of the 20th century, from the years around 1900 to the quiet unfolding of 1910, the weight of continuity pressed upon daily life with such steadiness that even the inventions, conflicts, and expansions, so often remembered by later generations, seemed in practice to merge into the long rhythm of repetition that defined existence across both continents. And one must begin again with the farms and rural districts, where the cultivation of wheat in Canada and the United States, the growing of corn and cotton in the American South, the tending of cattle upon the Argentine pampas, and the endless labor of coffee and sugar plantations in Brazil all unfolded with the same seasonal cycles that had governed agriculture for centuries. Men rising at dawn to lead animals to fields, guiding plows, sowing seed, reaping harvest, women preparing meals, mending garments, teaching children, all beneath skies that brightened and darkened with an inevitability that dulled the imagination. And though machines such as tractors and reapers had begun to appear, their noise and clatter were themselves repetitive, a new layer of monotony, added to the old, while in towns and cities the expansion of streets, buildings, and populations brought not excitement but simply more of the same. 4 shopkeepers opened their stores each morning, arranged goods, counted coins, recorded transactions, and closed at evening. Clerks filled ledgers in offices with lines of figures that stretched across pages. Factories filled with machines, stamping, spinning, and cutting in ceaseless repetition. And railroads carried passengers and freight along fixed routes that repeated journeys day after day, with stations filled with the same waiting, the same whistles, the same departures, and the same arrivals, so that the expansion of industry and trade was experienced not as a rupture, but as an intensification of the steady sameness that lulled societies forward. And in the realm of government, one observes again the monotony of sessions, whether in Washington, Buenos Aires, Mexico City, or Rio de Janeiro, with legislators convening, reading bills aloud, debating at length, recording votes, all in slow and repetitive fashion, and presidents or ministers delivering speeches in formal tones that echoed previous addresses, while clerks copied records into bound volumes, storing them in archives that filled shelves with documents nearly indistinguishable in content. And in the daily lives of ordinary people, the spread of electricity, and of telephones altered routines only slightly, for lamps glowed in the evening, but meals were still eaten in the same order. Conversations continued in the same topics, and prayers were recited in the same cadence. Streetcars rattled along tracks, but carried the same passengers along the same streets at the same hours. And telephones rang with a bell, but conveyed voices speaking the same worries about health, prices, and family, so that novelty collapsed again into repetition. And in cultural matters, the story was equally monotonous, with newspapers multiplying their editions, but filling them with advertisements, repeating familiar claims, serialized stories unfolding week after week, and political commentary circling the same arguments, while schools continued to instruct through rote memorization, teachers writing the same sums upon blackboards, students reciting the same lines, and universities delivered lectures in the same slow tones, their halls filled with note-taking that differed little from the classrooms of the previous century. And if one looks to the religious life of the Americas in these years, one finds churches filled weekly, sermons delivered in the same structures of thought, hymns sung to the same melodies, confessions whispered in the same booths, and festivals celebrated with the same processions, bells, and candles, so that faith too was woven into the fabric of continuity. And even where change appeared to loom, such as in the slow approach of conflicts in Mexico leading toward revolution, or in the labor disputes of industrializing cities in the north, or in the quiet tensions of colonial dependencies in the Caribbean, the lived experience of most was still one of endless routine, with work repeated, meals prepared, streets crossed, and hours passed, all in a rhythm that dulled crisis into continuity. And across the hemisphere, whether in the frozen landscapes of Canada, the industrial towns of New England, the cotton fields of the American South, the plazas of Mexico, the pampas of Argentina, or the plantations of Brazil, the impression was one of life lived in cycles, where one day echoed the last, where one year echoed the next, and where history itself felt less like a march of events than like the slow ticking of a clock in a quiet room, each tick blending into the next, carrying the hemisphere toward the great transformations of the century to come, not in leaps or bursts, but in the soft, drowsy continuity of repetition. And thus to understand the first decade of the 20th century in the Americas is to imagine a continent humming with sameness. The buzz of machines, the tolling of bells, the voices of clerks, the footsteps of workers, the cries of vendors, all blending into a monotonous lullaby that stretched across fields, towns, and cities, soothing in its predictability, wearying in its uniformity, and hypnotic in its calm inevitability. As the Americas drifted deeper into the years of the 1910s, before the entry of the hemisphere into the wider conflagration of the Great War, the texture of life across both continents continued to be woven from the same threads of repetition, routine, and unhurried continuity. For while historians later emphasize the coming of industrial might, the rise of new political movements, and the mounting tensions that would eventually connect the New World to the struggles of Europe, the lived reality of daily existence for the overwhelming majority remained profoundly monotonous, marked by the slow unfolding of days that resembled one another with such regularity that memory itself blurred them into a haze of sameness. And to picture this one must begin with the farms of North America, where in the vast expanses of the Canadian prairies and the American Midwest, wheat and corn were sown and reaped with the same seasonal cadence, men rising with the dawn to guide, machines or teams of horses across fields, women preparing meals, preserving produce, mending clothes, and instructing children, and evenings spent around wooden tables where oil lamps or electric bulbs glowed faintly as families spoke of the same matters, whether health, prices, and neighbors, while in the South, cotton still bent the backs of countless laborers, its planting, tending, and picking unfolding with the same repetitive drudgery that had defined the crop for generations. And in Latin America, the cycles of agriculture were equally unbroken, with coffee plantations in Brazil, cattle ranches in Argentina and Uruguay, sugar estates in the Caribbean, and maize fields in Mexico, all following the same rhythms of dawn, labor, midday toil, and evening rest, creating a pattern of life that seemed eternal in its continuity, and in towns and cities. Though electric lights glowed more brightly, though telephones buzzed, though streetcars rattled along tracks, the substance of daily life was little changed. For shopkeepers still raised shutters at morning, arranged goods, weighed produce, accepted coins, and recorded accounts in ledgers. Clerks still bent over desks, copying figures line by line. Factory workers still moved through gates at the ringing of whistles, their hands tending machines that repeated the same motions thousands of times a day. And children still sat in rows in classrooms, reciting lessons, scratching upon slates or copybooks, their voices rising and falling in the same cadences heard for decades, so that the sense of novelty dissolved into sameness. And if one turns to the great cities New York, Buenos Aires, Rio de Janeiro, Mexico City, one must imagine not excitement but a steady pulse of repetition. Traffic moving at fixed hours, markets opening and closing, trams arriving and departing, newspapers hawked by boys crying the same headlines, while families in apartments or houses passed their evenings in the same fashion, meals taken, prayers spoken, books read, conversations repeated, all under the slow ticking of clocks whose hands moved with implacable steadiness. And in the sphere of government the routines were equally monotonous. 4 legislatures met, read bills, debated, amended, and voted. Officials signed decrees, clerks copied records, and presidents delivered addresses whose formal language echoed earlier speeches. While in Latin America, parliaments, assemblies, and congresses conducted themselves in the same repetitive fashion, with endless speeches, prolonged debates, and predictable outcomes. And though revolutions and strikes appeared, as in Mexico's upheaval beginning in 1910, or labor unrest in industrial centers, the majority of people experienced even these through the monotony of waiting, of enduring shortages, of listening to rumors repeated again and again, of continuing their household chores, of tending fields as best they could, and of surviving from one day to the next. And in cultural life, the sameness was equally apparent, with newspapers filled with serialized novels, advertisements repeating familiar promises, essays circling old arguments, and in homes music played. On pianos or phonographs repeated the same tunes, while churches still rang with hymns sung in the same melodies, sermons preached in the same cadences, and festivals celebrated with the same processions, bells and candles, so that faith, too, folded itself into the fabric of continuity. And even as motion pictures began to flicker in small theaters, the experience was marked by repetition, with reels turning, images flashing, and audiences attending week after week to see variations on familiar stories, so that even the marvel of cinema quickly settled into routine, another gesture repeated in the endless cycles of modern life. And across the hemisphere, whether in the frozen north, the bustling industrial towns, the rural villages, or the tropical plantations, the essence of life was sameness, one day following another, one year blending into the next, until the approach of the wider war in Europe seemed less like a rupture than like a faint sound approaching slowly across the ocean. And thus, the Americas in the years immediately before the First World War must be understood not in terms of sudden transformation, but in terms of unbroken continuity. The steady hum of machines, the tolling of bells, the clicking of telegraphs, the murmurs of prayers, the footsteps of workers, all blending into a hypnotic monotone that lulled societies forward, preparing them unconsciously for the changes to come, while enveloping them in the soothing, weary sameness of daily life. As the Americas drifted into the years of the First World War, the slow continuity of their long 19th century, stretching from 1789 through decades of gradual repetition, finally reached its threshold, though even this moment, remembered later as a time of dramatic entry into global affairs, was lived in daily life as the same long unfolding of routine, For while governments debated neutrality, mobilization, and participation, while armies prepared for eventual involvement, and while ships carried goods across oceans increasingly threatened by conflict, the great majority of men, women, and children in both North and South America experienced these years not as a sudden break, but as another sequence in the long chain of monotony, where the fields still demanded sowing and harvest, the shops still required opening and closing, the factories still turned their machines, the schools still repeated their lessons, and the churches still tolled their bells, so that the substance of existence remained as it had always been, a rhythm of labor, of prayer, of conversation, of meals, of rest, and of sleep. And one can imagine the households of 1914 in the United States, where fathers read newspapers at breakfast while children prepared for school, where mothers oversaw kitchens filled with the smell of bread and porridge, where evenings brought lamps and books and simple talk, the subjects shifting slightly toward news of Europe, but the tone and rhythm remaining identical to earlier decades. And similarly in Canada, where wheat farmers bent to their fields, where townspeople filled general stores, where ministers preached sermons, where train stations filled with passengers, and where each day echoed the last with soothing regularity. And in Latin America the situation was no different, for though nations declared neutrality or debated alliances, the routines of coffee, sugar, cattle, and maize continued to govern the lives of millions, the dawn bringing the same crow of roosters, the same smoke rising from kitchens, the same work in rows of crops, the same prayers whispered at midday, the same weariness at dusk, and the same meals of bread, beans, meat, or maize taken in homes where children laughed or quarreled, parents spoke in measured tones, and elders remembered the past in words that repeated familiar lessons. And in the cities, whether Buenos Aires, Rio de Janeiro, Mexico City, Havana, or Santiago, the streets filled each morning with carts, trams, and automobiles, now more common, but following the same schedules, the same stops, the same slow traffic, and the same closing of shops at evening, while clerks copied figures into ledgers, telegraphs clicked out messages, typewriters clattered with keys, striking paper in ceaseless rhythm, and offices echoed with the murmurs of conversations that circled the same topics of trade, finance, and politics, so that modernity itself became another layer of monotony. And even as America moved closer to war, with parades, recruitment drives, and patriotic speeches, these too became part of the repetitive texture of life. Parades marching in the same steps, flags waving in the same breeze, speeches repeating the same appeals, songs sung to the same tunes, until participation in global conflict itself seemed to merge with the continuity of routine. And in homes, the presence of soldiers' letters created new rituals of reading and rereading, of waiting for news, of praying for safety. Yet even this was marked by the monotony of anticipation, of checking the post each day, of folding and unfolding paper, of repeating hopes and fears, and in factories that produced goods for the war effort, whether munitions, uniforms, or ships, the labor was repetitive to the point of hypnosis, with workers guiding machines, stitching cloth, hammering metal, and packing crates hour after hour, day after day, while outside the factory gates the rhythm of the city continued unchanged. Vendors crying out wares, children playing in streets, bells ringing from towers, and trains steaming in and out of stations, carrying people and goods with the same cadence as before, and in rural villages the war was often distant, its presence marked only by occasional news, by shortages, or by the absence of young men. But the daily life of tending animals, planting crops, fetching water, preparing meals, and gathering at evening persisted in its eternal repetition. And thus, even as the Americas entered into the global stage, the essence of existence remained what it had been for over a century, a sequence of gestures repeated until they formed a lullaby of history, soothing in its monotony, hypnotic in its continuity, and unbroken in its rhythm. And when one looks back upon the span from 1789 to the years of the First World War, what emerges is not a tale of constant upheaval, but a panorama of sameness, of bells tolling through generations, of clocks ticking in parlors and offices, of fields ploughed and harvested in cycles, of sermons preached in the same tones, of letters written and read in the same hand, of songs sung in the same voices, of governments debating in the same halls, and of families gathered at the same tables, so that history itself appears less as a march of progress than as a gentle rocking motion, carrying societies forward in slow waves that lull the observer into calm, into weariness, and at last into rest, and thus the full history of the Americas. From the founding of republican institutions in 1789 to the entry into the First World, war is best understood as an extended sleep story, a century and more of repetition, of routine, of continuity, in which the lives of millions blended into a fabric of sameness that dulled the senses, soothed the imagination, and encouraged, above all, the closing of eyes, the slowing of breath, and the surrender to slumber.